Hello and welcome to our session here at SUSECon. We want to talk about automating cluster baseline rollouts so you get a solid foundation for your clusters. We want to talk about our project goals here and challenges we faced in setting up the baseline for your cluster. Talk about the components we use for our baseline, automating the rollouts. So we want to show how we get the baseline up and running, and some key takeaways you can keep in mind to get your baseline up and running. That's Tobias and I'm Noah. I'm Senior DevOps Engineer at Adfinis, and Tobias is our team lead of the integration team here at Adfinis. Adfinis, just a quick glance here, we are a leading service provider in the open source environment and have a strong inner and open source mindset. So we are strongly open source driven. We have over 10 years of SUSE partnership and many years of knowledge in that field, from development to deployment, with an excellent team that's working globally. So that enables us to do 24/7 support around the world and help our clients to focus on their business. So what's the challenges in terms of creating a solid baseline and why you need it? So with growing environments, there comes complexity because configuration and scale is hard. So if you have multiple clusters, they want to be configured, they want to be customized, and they need to be scalable. So you need a solid foundation to be able to manage your clusters when they are growing over time, and you want to know what's running inside the clusters and know how to manage it. You want to customize that as well because you have different use cases in multiple clusters. Like for test and prod environment, you have difference in alerting rules, for example, or in the tools you want to use there. As well, for the scalability, if you scale up your environment, you have to keep track of all the updates and upgrades and all the configuration for your updates, for example. And you want to do the whole setup secure. So you need to manage security rules, baselines in terms of security. You want to avoid default credentials, for example. If you roll out your tools in tens, hundreds, or thousands of clusters, there's a great chance that you forget to change your default credentials sometime in the future. So you want to have that secure. This means we want to be scalable and flexible. We want to scale up by demand. We want to get a cluster up and running fast. So we want to have minimal deployment time, and we want to be consistent across all the clusters so we are able to manage that environment. Otherwise, we cannot keep track eventually in the future, because if there's too many inconsistencies, we cannot catch up there with our manpower. And we want to be secure and compliant. Of course, as I said, there's a growing demand and growing security use cases, and you cannot manage all your clusters in terms of security and compliancy without having a good baseline and your configuration in mind. So let's have a look at our baseline we chose. We want to go through some components and discuss that a little bit. Our baseline consists, for example, of SUSE monitoring, which is a great tool to have in the stack. As you can see, we use multiple SUSE tools here because it's really great integrated there, and we have a solid baseline without just installing them. So it's a great choice here to use SUSE monitoring. We will discuss that in a bit. We want to have a basic monitoring here to have all the key metrics in mind, to have a quick overview if we jump into the cluster, what's going on, what's going wrong. And SUSE monitoring is a great tool to get first insight into the cluster. As well with SUSE logging, we use SUSE logging because we want to ship our logs outside of the cluster to get a central overview of the logs. And with SUSE logging, we have the flexibility to do that. We are able as well to gather the logs inside the cluster, but SUSE logging also offers the flexibility to ship that outside the cluster with fine granular rules to do that, and to distribute the logs, for example, differently between the application we are running and the infrastructure components we use inside the cluster. So the storage is a great tool to get the cluster up and running fast, because if we install SUSE Storage, which is Longhorn, below that, we can simply use the local storage to get our PVCs up and running and our application up and running fast in the cluster. SUSE Security, which is NeuVector, basically, is also a great tool to get our secure baseline over all clusters. And we use alerting in combination with monitoring to get our alerts, for example, in Slack or via email or on PagerDuty, for example, to get alerts about basic stuff like if the PVC is running full, if SUSE Storage is running out of space, or if we have some alerts in the monitoring itself. Cert Manager is used in our baseline to automatically provision certificates. So we want to have our application that ships as well the certificate request or directly from the issuer, directly from the ingress using the issuer reference here. So we are able to use the Cert Manager to provision automatically our certificates. Step User is used for the integration with, for example, Let's Encrypt. So we get a public known certificate here that's valid on all devices. External DNS is used in our baseline for integration with DNS. So we are able to register our hosts in DNS to be able to just do a simple forward from the DNS, for example, like for ingress hosts and or the basic monitoring, I would say, in terms of the host changes and if some nodes come up or go down. Valero is used as backup. We will discuss that in a few seconds, which it's also a solid baseline tool here. Let's talk about the components SUSE monitoring a bit deeper here. SUSE monitoring consists of Prometheus, Grafana, and Alert Manager. So that's all operator based, which is great in terms of flexible deployment and automatic rollouts. So we have a really baseline monitoring here. As I said, it's great for basic observation. It comes with pre-built dashboards. So we have a really quick time to get that up and running, and we customize that later on via CADs with custom dashboards, for example, for Longhorn and other tools we use in terms of infrastructure. So we can have a great overview for all that's going on inside the cluster. And we ship SUSE monitoring with alerts. So we are able to monitor and get alerts out of SUSE monitoring here. That's as well shipped with CRDs inside the baseline. Let's have a look at SUSE Security as well. So with SUSE Security, we ship as well security policies to be compliant. There are custom policies we use in a central place. These are defined as policy as code. So we are able to ship them with SUSE Security. So we do not have to do much to get our security baseline up and running. So if we deploy the cluster and the baseline is applied, it's secure by default, I would say, and have a solid baseline of security there. That has to be adjusted, of course, if the application is deployed. There has to be policies that come with it, so you can add them later on as well. There are compliance audits and scanning as well, so we can check if the nodes and applications are compliant, of course, and we have a vulnerability scanning for the hosts, for example, as well. So periodically, we are able to scan our whole environment using SUSE Security. And for the last example, I want to talk about the backup with Valero. It's a great tool for our baseline because it's as well a baseline backup, which means we roll it out and it's just running, it's just working. We have multiple customization options. So per cluster, we can define a retention, for example. You don't need a 1 year backup retention for a test cluster, for example, or you want to differentiate between your target locations for the backup. For example, if you want to upload to S3 or other storage, and you want to make exclusions in terms of customizations. So you want to exclude, for example, some infrastructure apps in the cluster. You don't need any monitoring metrics for your dev cluster 2 years ago, for example. So you can exclude that from the start on, and you can minimize your costs in the end, and be able to minimize your backup to the things you need. And Valero is application aware here. We are able to ship the custom hooks for example, SQL backups and other databases. So that's really service specific here, and that can be added later on as well. So that's a great tool as well for our baseline. So Toby will continue with the automation now and tell you how to automate all that stuff, or how we do the automation here.
Yeah, so let's start with the automation. We choose the SUSE monitoring as an example, but it's more or less the same also for the other baseline tools or for other components you want to include in the cluster baseline. We use Argo CD to roll out those baselines, but some of the techniques are also possible with Ranger Fleet or with Flux. So it's not, I would say, totally Argo CD specific. Otherwise, it was the easiest way to do it with Argo CD. Also, most of our customers are using Argo CD, so we wanted to use the tools they know. Well, when we take a look at the Helm charts, most of the more complex tools in the baseline stack comes with two Helm charts. There's the CRD chart and the application Helm chart. The CRD chart installs all the Kubernetes custom resource definitions for monitoring, logging, NeuVector, and all that stuff. This chart runs for each of the baseline tools that need CRDs. And then we have the application Helm chart, which deploys the services. Everything that's possible there to customize, we will configure through the application Helm chart. For example, the limits and request, or some initial config, for example, for Grafana, so that Grafana already has a single sign-on when it comes up with a key cloak, for example. Also, the Prometheus resource request and limits, since they are mostly dependent on the size of the retention and of the metrics. So here we need far more customization based on the size of the cluster and the workload that runs inside the clusters. We have then an additional configuration chart that we always use then when we need to apply custom configurations to those services. For example, to specify custom alert rules or additional alert rules for the customer because they want to integrate alert manager inside their own monitoring with webhooks, or they want to send emails to their ticket system so that that a ticket is generated always when an alert triggers, or it is sent to some sort of Slack or Teams integration, which will then trigger a notification there. And for example, for the monitoring chart, we also have a dashboard chart where we collect all the different dashboards we need inside the cluster for Kubernetes that are additional to the, I would say, included in the Helm charts. For example, we have one for Longhorn, and for some other services, we have some custom dashboards which we will add through this chart. And the next step is then how we automate it. With the Argo CD, we have the application set CAD, which helps us generating all the apps we need, because everything starts with the baseline Helm chart. This is an app-in-app Helm chart, which is just a Helm chart which installs other application CADs inside the Argo CD instance. And with the application set, we will use the app generator and the cluster generator to then use the Helm chart, multiply it for each cluster. So each cluster gets its own instance of the application Helm chart and is then customized through a YAML definition file where we will override and customize the defaults. For example, the resource requests for Prometheus, the backup target and location for Velero, or the retention of the backups. And maybe also the tools that are running inside the cluster, because sometimes you have some clusters maybe in some difficult environments where you don't have a DNS server which is capable of syncing with external DNS. So you don't need the tool inside a cluster and can just disable it. This is all done with the customization and the templating of the baseline Helm chart, which will then utilize in all the baseline apps for each cluster. So the next step is then the bootstrapping, because you don't want to do all that stuff manually. In theory, the only thing that is really important is the customization, because that is something you need to choose for each cluster, because that's not always as easy that it can be automated, since often the cluster are really individual, dependent on the workload and the size. So, but what we can do is we normally do the deployments of the cluster via infrastructure as code. So we have our YAML definition, which will then create the cluster inside Ranger, and normally use the node or cluster driver from Ranger to then build up a Kubernetes cluster in their environment. And we will also then use the data from the created cluster and create an appropriate cluster secret in Argo CD, so that the cluster is then created in Argo CD. Argo CD will get credentials from Ranger so that it can access those clusters. And we can then use those new created cluster in our workflow. Since the cluster generator runs for every cluster inside Argo CD, we will automatically generate new applications for each cluster that is registered in Argo CD. And therefore, when a new cluster gets generated, it will automatically get a default cluster baseline, and it can easily later on be customized via a customization file, so that then we can adapt the retention for the backups, the retention for the Argo, for the Prometheus metrics, and all that stuff easily without much effort.
All right. Thank you, Toby, for your part. Let's wrap up the session a little bit, and yeah, I will tell you some stuff you can take away from here. So first thing is standards reduce complexity. This means define your standard, your tools you want to use. There are great tools out there. The baseline components we showed you are not the best maybe for your use case. It's the best for our use cases, but the most important thing is define your standard. So you will need a solid baseline in terms of standards you are defined, because that ensures stability and security. Because if you know what's running inside your cluster, you are able to manage that and you are able to run that securely. So your components need to be flexible, customizable, and scalable, because you will run these tools in many of your clusters, and maybe these are tens, hundreds, or even thousands of instances running. So that needs to be scalable, but even customizable in the end, and flexible. Templating is key here, because you don't want to define your stuff over and over again, and you need templates for that to keep that thing together. But do not over customize. So you don't want to define for every cluster again and again your customization, because everything is different. Try to choose your standard. Try to do as little as customization as needed, and automate that. So you want to have your rollout automated, because automation is key in terms of scalability, and if you want to act quickly and get things up and running quickly. And we learned as well, SUSE offers a solid baseline in terms of these components we showed you. So maybe you can just take a quick look, and even further on, if the environment is growing, you can switch to tools like SUSE Observability, for example. But in general, these are great tools for start, and even later on in the scaled environment. All right, thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great SUSECon. Maybe you could get a little grant at our solid baseline, and you can get your baseline up and running in a solid way. Thank you.